occasion for you being on the show tonight is that you co-wrote a book with Noam Chomsky called The Myth of American Idealism, how U.S. foreign policy endangers the world. And before we get into the content of this, I really do just want to take a minute. You co-wrote a book with Noam Chomsky. That's completely fucking cool.
Yeah, no, this is probably the highlight of my my life, certainly my career as a public intellectual. I mean, my God, the man is like, when you look at the list of the most cited thinkers in human history, it's like, it goes like, you know, Plato, Marx, Aristotle, Hegel, Chomsky. So yeah, no, it was incredible getting to do this. And I actually was able to bring something to the table, right? Because you think, what can I possibly bring to a collaboration with Noam Chomsky? But the cool thing about this book is that it's Chomsky's like depth of knowledge with my kind of prose flair. And I think we achieved a synthesis that is extremely satisfying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, I mean, this is something like, I mean, I've always, you know, I have been reading your stuff for, you know, several years before I actually knew you. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about your writing is that, you know, I mean, it's always very like accessible and fun, but it's not just that. I mean, it's like, I feel like a lot of people, you read an article or a book that they wrote, and the sort of sense that you get is like, oh, here's the stuff I know, and I'm going to like share this with you. Right. And, you know, it's not necessarily bad. Right. But I think the sense I always get when I'm reading your writing is like, here's something interesting I'm thinking about, and like, I'm going to kind of invite you, the reader, in, and we're going to like figure this out together. Right.
Yeah.
Like, and so, yeah, I think it is a really cool, combination. And, you know, and it's also synthesizing a lot of what, you know, Chomsky has been writing about over the last, bunch of decades. Right?
Yeah, well, since 1967, essentially, when he started doing political writing.
Yeah, right. I mean, I remember, so there's like a really thin book that he wrote called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, which is basically has to do with the Vietnam War. And that's certainly the earliest Chomsky thing that I've ever read.
Yeah, that's from the New York Review of Books. They republished it as its own standalone book in like an anniversary edition. But it was originally this essay in the New York Review of Books. That's one. I don't know if it's his first or one of his first ever. Because up until that point, he was political, but he had just been writing on linguistics.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is right. I mean, he had those politics. I mean, I remember, I remember watching that documentary, Manufacturing Consent, long enough ago that I can vividly remember renting it from the video store, that it was like 2 VHSs with a rubber band.
Oh, it's long. Yeah.
One of those. And it was, and in there, I mean, there's a really striking story about, his reaction to the bombing of Hiroshima, which like everybody around him was very happy about. And, he was, because, hey, great, we won. Right. And he was very disturbed by it. And he like goes for a walk in the woods or something. And, it does give you like some sense of the time scale here, right? Like, exactly how long guy's been around. And, he certainly had these, political impulses. I mean, he was, like really interested in anarcho-syndicalism, and, I mean, somewhat ironically now, Zionism, right? That like a point I saw him make many times, is that, as like a sort of socialist Zionist youth activist before the creation of the state of Israel, what he advocated is now what would be considered to be an extreme form of anti-Zionism, right? That it should be like, there should be a binational, Jewish and Arab state. So he had all these views forever, but he sort of kept himself busy revolutionizing linguistics and sort of laying the foundations for contemporary cognitive science. And it wasn't until the late 60s, when he starts to feel like, okay, with the United States is, whether or not you think it's exactly according to Hoyle genocide, is like certainly committing genocide level crimes in Southeast Asia, and it's sort of incumbent on me to like speak and write about this as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I tried to do in the book, because my kind of role in the book was to help him, to work with him to organize his writing and thought. There's some that's original to the book, but most of it is kind of woven together from observations he's made over the course of those 50 years. And he started with the conflict in Southeast Asia. He commented on Israel-Palestine, on the wars in Central America in the 80s. And I wanted to, because I think all of those things need to be revisited, because I think that his critique of the Vietnam War is so important and powerful, and we still don't understand what the Vietnam War was, and it's still most precisely explained in the pages of out-of-print Chomsky books. We have a chapter on the Vietnam War that really sort of draws together those arguments that he was making at the time.
Right. Okay. Well, let's get into this. So I want to get to the Vietnam stuff, fairly quickly here, but I want to start off, kind of chronologically here, where the book starts off, and like actually maybe even before that, just sort of, you've kind of said this already, but I mean maybe just sort of more directly. What's what's the overall mission statement here? Yeah. With this book. I mean, obviously kind of talked about like what you were doing with it, but I mean, like what's the sort of overarching thing, right? This is also, I believe, the only Nathan Robinson book that's ever been spotted at airport bookstores, right? So
I saw it I've seen it in multiple different airports. New Orleans Airport Bookstore. I was because as a writer, it's long been my ambition to have an airport book. And I love that this is not what you would think of as an airport book, but this is my first airport book. Not
even a little bit, but okay. Somebody's at the bookstore at the airport looking for something new on their flight. They decide they don't feel like Stephen King today. They'd like a little informative.
Let's get a different horror story. Let's get the story of United States. How far away you think Stephen King freaks you out? Wait till you read our account of the bombing of Laos, because it'll give you some nightmares.
Yeah. So this person who's like coming in who might not like this wider audience that might be reading this, right? They probably aren't current affairs readers. They're like whatever, general interest readers. Like, what's the sort of biggest thing that you want to convince this person of?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting about your question is that your question was what was in my mind going into the project, which is, but in a slightly different way, which is, okay, Chomsky has all this analysis of all these different conflicts, but what is the common theme here? What is, if you were to collect Noam Chomsky's works and you were to say, okay, well, what links his writing on Vietnam to his writing on Iraq, other than that it's anti-war criticism? And one of the things that came out of putting all these texts together and kind of noticing the common themes is the way in which a propagandistic story is told about U.S. conduct that is held by both Republicans and Democrats, that is a bipartisan story, and the way that story is totally at odds with the actual historical record. And you can trace the history of your country by reading all of the rhetoric about what your country did. And there, or you can trace the history of your country on a kind of different level, which is to trace all the facts of what your country. And one of what Chomsky has long done is said, well, let's set aside the official propaganda. Let's set aside what you're reading in the op-ed pages of the New York Times, and let's set aside what the president says, and let's try and go and find the facts of what actually happened. And so what this book does is go over the entire history of post-war United States foreign policy and try and explain what actually happened, why it was done, who it was done to, what the consequences were for both the United States and the world. And it's a it's a record of unbelievable violence and cruelty and unbelievable deception, to the point where even Americans who are quite cynical about their government, and it's a little different putting out a Chomsky book today when everyone's a little more cynical about, say, the Iraq War than they were in 2003, and a lot of Chomsky conclusions are things that you might hear Tucker Carlson or Curtis Yarvin or someone say something kind of similar about, elites, because a lot of Chomsky's insights have kind of percolated. But so what they get out of that is, you pick up the Chomsky book and your eyes are opened to not only what actually happened, but how people were deceived. And I really do think even those cynical people, even those people who think they know everything that happened, will find in this book things they didn't know about. Maybe they know about most of it, but there are things in the endnotes, because we have a giant section of endnotes, but there's so much that you are just not told about what happened. So if you want to understand your country, and if you want to understand its role in the world, and you want to understand who you are, where you come into the context of all that came before you, as Kamala Harris said, right? You need to pick up Chomsky, because Chomsky will help situate you and help you understand what the state is, what the United States is, and how power works in the world.
Yeah, right. One way to think about this, right? You start the book talking about mafia logic, and it's very often the case that the way people talk about U.S. foreign policy, I think somewhat less now for some of the reasons that you were just talking about, but even now, right, to a very great extent, kind of the worst thing that you could say about it is that we did something foolish or misguided. Yeah. That the Vietnam War, for example, was a mistake, a tragic mistake. That the invasion of Iraq, was a mistake.
Big mistake. Mistake. So many mistakes.
Yeah, which is, at a certain point, right? It's like this sort of. The sort of cliched, like Stalinist, looking back at at some dictatorship that committed terrible atrocities. Well, mistakes were made, right? And I think that a lot of the sort of breath of fresh air that I always felt like I was getting from reading Chomsky, and I think a lot of what's in this book is saying, no, like, we're not talking about mistakes. It's not as if that there was this sort of, attempt to do something else that just kind of through some bizarre series of accidents ended up, killing, millions of, Vietnamese and Cambodia and then, Laotian peasants, for example. Or, there was some basically noble thing that, that just sort of accidentally ended up destroying Iraq, right? So in the first chapter of the book, Disciplining the Global South, you start out by talking about Salvador Allende, and maybe for me, I've been accused of never being able to get past 2016, right? Everything is the sort of replaying of the original tragedy of lost Bernie election, but I always think of one of the most amazing moments from the Bernie Hillary debates, which was when Hillary said that Henry Kissinger, was a good friend and advisor, and I'm not going to do a Bernie impression, but he said, I'm happy to say Henry Kissinger is not my friend, and he brought up Salvador Allende, and you could tell that a lot of people in the audience and the moderator were kind of like, wait, who?
Yeah. The point that you're making here, this is one of the most crucial Chomsky insights, the things that really opens people's eyes, is Chomsky talks about the spectrum of debate that ranges from, if you take the Vietnam War, it ranges from, well, it was a good war and we shouldn't have quit Vietnam, we betrayed Vietnam, to it was a good war, but it was a catastrophe and we couldn't win it. And that's what you read in the New York Times, is it was a disastrous war. We didn't achieve our objectives. Chomsky takes you in a whole different direction, which he says, well, actually, we did achieve a lot of our objectives, right? Our objective was essentially to make sure that the price of a North Vietnamese victory was extremely, extremely high. Right, and we did make sure that essentially that the country was destroyed. Right, so you can't, unless you're willing to see the country destroyed, you better not take on the United States. And this is where we get to this kind of Godfather logic that he talks about, where he says, oftentimes, and you see this so often, even in ostensible critics of the U.S. government. So like Stephen Walt, who's a great realist international relations scholar, still has a book called The Hell of Good Intentions, which is about, we mean so well, but all these disasters keep happening. There's a new book coming out by a Palestinian and American negotiator about the Israel-Palestine peace process. And they say, essentially, like, why is it? They're like agonizing, like, the Americans meant so well. They really wanted to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, but they just couldn't. So all these mistakes, these terrible mistakes they made. And Chomsky comes along and says, no, the United States deliberately thwarted the peace process. Like, we deliberately made sure that a Palestinian state didn't come into existence. And there's a totally different way of looking at it, right? So there's the critics who say, well, the United States made all these terrible mistakes, and they're the reason a Palestinian state didn't come into existence, but, Bill Clinton was acting in good faith. And Chomsky goes, we weren't acting in good faith. We were vetoing UN resolutions all the time, affirming the Palestinians' right to a state. And I'll give you one more example. I recently debated an Obama State Department official at the Oxford Literary Festival named Edward Fishman. And he's a very nice guy. And I got through my spiel on the Chomsky book where I was explaining exactly this. I said, oftentimes the spectrum of debate, it ranges from it was good to it was bad, but we meant well. And I cite Samantha Power saying, the United States has never committed any crimes. And I said, so, they can't admit that we can ever commit a crime. The worst that we're capable of is a well-intentioned mistake. And then they turned it over. So I gave all of this, and I went through lots of examples here. And I said, these weren't mistakes. These were policy that was deliberately made and deliberately discounting the value of non-American lives. And their lives just didn't factor into the calculus. They turned it over to Fishman, the Obama State Department official. And he says, well, obviously, I agree with Nathan Robinson. The United States has made a lot of mistakes. Those mistakes have often caused right? And I was like, this can't even penetrate your brain. This concept.
Yeah, this is Marge Simpson trying to order coffee in Australia. Coffee, beer, right? Coffee.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like so deeply contrary to the way the parameters of acceptable debate that that it's sort of like becomes kind of hilariously unthinkable. And I'm really glad, by the way, that what you just said, you brought up Walt and realism, because I think that there's thinking about the extent to which a sort of good Chomsky kind of skepticism about American foreign policy has or hasn't penetrated more generally. Something that I see a lot of, right, is that there are people on the right, especially, who will describe themselves as anti-interventionists. And, of course, one issue with that is, I think oftentimes when you really start looking into the details, not really, right? Like that they,
war. They want to do a different war.
Yeah, exactly right. They don't like the war in Ukraine because it's liberal coded, although God knows that might be changing. As Trump is president now. Um, U.S. funding for Israel's demolition of Gaza, or don't want like a Cold War with Russia, but are all in favor of a Cold War with China, etc. Right? So that's like one issue. But another issue is that the way that they explain it, like, weirdly assumes American idealism, right? I mean, the people,
they're like, why are we doing this charity project in Ukraine?
Exactly, right?
Like, like, this isn't a charity. We're not trying to help Ukraine. What are you talking about? They accept the premise that we're trying to help Ukraine because we care about, we're making a sacrifice because we really just care about the Ukrainians so much. And why would you care about the Ukrainians that much? And whereas, we know that it's they saw a cheap opportunity to erode the power of a geopolitical rival.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a way, a lot of this sort of, right-wing, half-assed non-interventionism that, at least sort of will claim an affinity to foreign policy realism a la Walt and Mearsheimer, is really always framed in terms of, if anything, I mean, it sort of becomes the foreign policy equivalent of the Albert Hirschman in his book, The Rhetoric of Reaction, right? Talks about this, the futility thesis, which is for domestic politics, liberal do-gooders are always trying to do things to help people, but actually it never works and it can't work. You try to raise the minimum wage, you just get more unemployment, all this stuff. And it just becomes the foreign policy equivalent of that. It's actually the problem is that that naive idealists who go around the world trying to spread freedom and democracy, that don't understand the way the world works and don't understand the inevitability of self-interest, blah, blah, blah. And that's why you end up getting these disasters like the war in Iraq, right? So, I mean,
because you didn't understand that the Iraqis, weren't capable of democracy. Because there could be a kind of racist element, right? Which is you had too high of beliefs in the Afghans. You thought you could bring democracy to them, but they are these tribal peasants, and so they're incapable of this. Instead of you supported a corrupt and unpopular government that made the Taliban look desirable by comparison, which is the actual truth of the story.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and in some cases, I think there really is a racist element to it, like Tucker Carlson, who started out as a big backer of the global war on terror, when he was on Crossfire, right? That was his position, and I'm not sure what the exact chronology is of him sort of coming to be this paleocon who's skeptical of some of these wars, but I do know there's a recording that came out at some point of Tucker Carlson referring to Iraqis as semi-literate primitive monkeys. Right, and that does seem to have been some element in his thought process.
That's why the war was such a bad idea.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. Right? It's you think these primitive monkeys can know how to have a democratic society like we can? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or maybe the problem was that we got there and we fired the entire government, including all of the civil servants who knew how to do their job and keep the country running, and we told them they couldn't work anymore.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we'll get to Iraq, but I do want to start out in Vietnam, right? So this is chapter 2, the war on Southeast Asia, because this is. I mean, in some ways, I mean, Vietnam really feels like patient zero to me for this narrative about bumbling American good intentions, right? The way that people talk about it as if Vietnam was this patch of quicksand, that the United States, through no particular fault of its own, got, people use these phrases like we got drawn into, the war, like, there's really no agency here, that it's like somehow or another there was this like gravitational, there was this gravitational pull of, napalming this peasant society. We sort of couldn't help it.
Yeah. We don't have any agency here. Well, and the story of Vietnam as the calamity is still very much told in liberal circles. I begin with the Ken Burns documentary, right? So there's the 2017 Ken Burns documentary about Vietnam, which has this incredible quote, which is very similar to quotes that were from the liberals in the 70s, looking back on the Vietnam War. So we've got we open the chapter with Ken Burns' narration on the Vietnam War, saying the war was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings, and it was continued through tragic decisions by presidents trying to muddle through. And Anthony Lewis of the New York Times had said in 1975 that it was a blundering effort to do good. And that story of the Vietnam War is still very commonly internalized by even Americans who think that the war was a bad idea, we should never have waged it. And a lot of Americans still think that it was a war for democracy. I saw John Fetterman about a year ago, I know you love him, had said something about the Vietnam War where he said, like, we were defending democracy in Vietnam. And it's just incredible to me. I mean, like, I don't have very high respect for his historical and knowledge and his knowledge of foreign policy, right? But I think it's an example of how, the fact that anyone could still say that we were defending democracy.
Just as a footnote here, by the way, I think you deserve a lot of credit for calling Fetterman sort of sooner than anybody else did. I mean,
I didn't know how bad he'd get.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody did.
He's worse than I had any idea he could be.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, during that election, I actually got some people on Twitter really mad at me because I wrote an article for Jacobin called John Fetterman is right about many things, but he's wrong about how.
Yeah, you did. You get credit too.
And so that much, at least, I picked up on, that he had this like terrible position on Israel-Palestine. But like overall, I was like, yeah, sure. Here's this guy who used some like nice like economic populist rhetoric here and there. He's like, I was trying to, I sort of saw it as like, oh, he's got this like giant blind spot about Palestine, but I think like then it just turned out, I was like, no, he just sucks, like in general, it's just awful, right? And
maybe he'll quit soon because he says he doesn't like doing his job.
Well,
he was complaining recently that they make him show up.
Well, I mean, as it turns out, you are just allowed to quit. I mean, like nobody's like, it's not like you're going to get like sued for breach of contract if you step down from your Senate seat. Like you can just leave anytime. But yeah, like I think you were probably the lefty commentator I saw who was sort of most unimpressed by the guy.
The Nathan Robinson apology forms. There's like a meme that's like a Nathan Robinson apology form, and you can check what you should apologize about. And it's one of them is like, I thought Fetterman was cool. Or like, I liked his posts. I liked the posting because he was, very, very sassy on social media. But one of the things
people enjoyed the way he was dunking on Dr. Oz, but I mean, I think the point you were making at the time was like, okay, but like, he's running for U.S. Senate. Don't we want to hear more of what Fetterman thinks about policy?
Yeah, we want shit poster in chief. That was one of the things that I noticed was, and this is why I think, to go back to, you'd say we are the Bernie bros who return constantly to the theme where you have to be like Bernie. But one of the differences that I noticed early on was if you examined what Fetterman was doing, you were like, wait, but there's no substance here. Like, he wasn't criticizing Dr. Oz because he didn't support Medicare for all, right? He was like criticizing Dr. Oz for living in New Jersey. And it's like, okay, like, yeah, criticize him for that,
Sure.
right? Do whatever works. Just go after him. Say he's a carpet-bagging, rich guy who says crudité instead of vegetable plate or whatever. But really hit him on the fact that, like, he's a quack who instead of believing in universal healthcare, believes in, like, magic pills that he'll sell you on television. And he wasn't doing that. And that made me think, well, okay, do you really care about, the universal healthcare part?
No, exactly, right. I mean, it's like I think that the thing that at the time I was like, trying to give Fetterman some credit for is, being a good communicator, but then it turns out it's like, okay, but like looking back on it, like there wasn't actually very much being communicated, right? Like it's
when you looked closely, there was really not much substance there. Anyway, yeah. So
anyway, so
all of it to say, he's also wrong about the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Which is, on a certain sense, like, okay, Vietnam War ended 50 years ago, so you think, it's maybe the least relevant thing that Fetterman is wrong about. But also,
here's what he said. Sorry, he said the brave. He said this National Vietnam War Veterans Day, I'm reflecting on the service and sacrifice of the brave men and women who defended our freedoms in Vietnam.
Oh my God.
Our freedoms.
So,
as if, like, I mean, Chomsky calls this like the theory that Ho Chi Minh was going to get in a canoe and end up in San Francisco. Like, if you didn't beat him there, like, he was going to be on the shores of the United States tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean,
you didn't even say defending the freedoms of the South Vietnamese, which was the justification at the time.
Right. So, which at least would make slightly more sense. He's defending the freedom of Americans from. I mean, really, also, like, the United States is. It really, the United States is an extraordinarily well-positioned country. I mean, we could, we could just, like, not have a standing army. We could just have, like, state National Guards, and it would be a really, really hard thing for anybody to invade the United States, right? Because it's surrounded by oceans on two sides, friendly countries on the other two, incredibly wealthy, et cetera, right? So, I don't actually think that the Viet Cong were in imminent danger of sweeping
peasant army that didn't even have shoes,
sweeping through the United States. But just just to kind of, like, start on this example. I mean, let's take the slightly less insane version of the Fetterman claim that the Vietnam War was being fought on behalf of the freedom of South Vietnamese people. What would be wrong with that?
So the standard narrative of the Vietnam War would be that there was communist aggression from the north, and South Vietnam was a free country, and we were defending the free country against the communist aggression from the north. And it turned out that it was very difficult to defend from communist aggression, and eventually we had to pour more and more resources into the war. It became unwinnable. The end. Standard story.
Right.
There are some complicating facts here. Daniel Ellsberg, in his memoir, he was working at the Rand Corporation, and he talks about how he came to the realization. He eventually linked the Pentagon Papers, and how he came to the realization that this was not a noble war, but a war that was inherently morally wrong. Like, it was a bad war, not a good war badly waged or a good war doomed, a bad war. And he said the first thing that he realized was that we had defended French colonialism. So after World War II, the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, had issued the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence from French colonialism and said, post-war, we want to be an independent country. We don't want the French to take back this country after the occupation. And Ho Chi Minh recited the U.S. Declaration of Independence and pleaded with Truman to honor the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, to support Vietnam becoming an independent, free country instead of returning to French colonial rule. The United States supported the return of French colonial rule. Not only did the United States support the return of French colonial rule, but the United States funded the French occupation, even as the French were were finding it impossible to continue occupying Vietnam. And at one point, the United States was paying for something like 80% of the weaponry that France was using to maintain Vietnam under colonial domination. Okay, so that raises a question as to whether it's true that we care about Vietnamese self-governance, because we had a very clear opportunity to support the freedom of the Vietnamese, and instead we wanted them under a colonial oppressor. So Ellsberg says that was the moment when he finally understood that we had supported France occupying Vietnam, that he thought, well, clearly there's something wrong with the whole narrative here. And it turns out there's something very deeply wrong with the narrative, which is to say that the United States opposed elections in Vietnam. That's the core fact, if you want to make it about democracy and freedom, is that the South Vietnamese government was a dictatorship, and we were opposing consistently elections because we thought elections would elect communists, and we didn't want communists.
Yeah, I believe Dwight Eisenhower actually says that in so many words in his memoir that, of course, we couldn't allow an election in South Vietnam. The communists would have won.
Because Ho Chi Minh would win, because he was seen as a great patriot. He was seen as the George Washington of Vietnam.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, seen in that light, right? I mean, like, you have this, this immense devastation, and it's really, like, immense to an extent that's actually, like, really hard to overstate, right? I mean, like when you look at the years upon years of the most powerful military machine that had ever existed, just pounding the hell out of this peasant society
with chemical weapons, napalm, Agent Orange, defoliating, destroying the crops, poisoning people, giving them cancer, dropping cluster bombs that go off for decades later. I mean, really, I mean, a couple million people, Vietnamese people, died in this war. This country is the size of Florida.
Yeah, right, exactly. And this is how you end up getting, like, I remember there's this Hal Draper article from just after the Tet Offensive where he basically says, look, I was always against the war, and, because if you basically saw what was going on here as a Vietnamese civil war that the United States was intervening in, I'm against that, right? But now it's clear that this is just not the character of this war at all, right? And and his evidence for that was the Tet Offensive, that you could have this huge populous capital city, like there's weeks and weeks of preparation and people setting up weapons depots and stuff all over it, and not one person reports it to the authorities, right? I mean, that's something that you only get in situations like, occupied France, things like that, where, like eventually you just get to a point where the population is just really united against, what they see as a foreign occupier.
Well, a really important point that comes out of the Chomsky analysis is Chomsky. And you start to notice this once you read textbooks and how much is focused on the bombing of North Vietnam, right? So there's all this controversy over the bombing of North Vietnam. And one of the things Chomsky points out is there's very little controversy over the bombing of South Vietnam.
Right.
And the reason is because that complicates the narrative of this as a war with North Vietnam, because it turned out that the bombing of South Vietnam was more extensive. Well, that's because essentially what was happening was a war between the unpopular South Vietnamese government and the population of South Vietnam, the peasant population that was turning against this oppressive dictatorial government. And North Vietnam intervened in the war and gave support to that peasant population, which opposed its government. But the United States, essentially, a lot of the time was at war with the South Vietnamese, right? The Viet Cong is a South Vietnamese group, not a North Vietnamese group, supported by the North Vietnamese, but it's a South.
Right.
It's a South Vietnamese opposition to the government. And so, if you're fighting the South Vietnamese most of the time, then your whole narrative of protecting the South Vietnamese against North Vietnamese aggression. The other thing is that South Vietnam and North Vietnam are distinctions that don't exist in the minds of most Vietnamese people. This is an artificial boundary that's drawn in 1954 and has very little to do with, they don't see themselves as two different nations. It's just Vietnam as it is today.
Yeah, I mean, this is right, that's the lyrics of the old Tom Paxton song, Lyndon Johnson Told the Nation, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from the Vietnamese.
Yeah.
There's one non-Vietnamese force fighting in Vietnam, which would be the United States. Again, even certainly initially, I mean, you started to get more of a North Vietnamese presence after actually in the Tet Offensive, much of the NLF was wiped out in that, right? But certainly for many years, right, the war is primarily being fought, against South Vietnamese insurgents, by the United States to directly continue the policy that began as an attempt to save French colonialism in Vietnam and prop up a profoundly unpopular government.
Yeah, but we're trying to suppress a peasant uprising against the dictatorial government that we're supporting is not a narrative that you can sell back home. That's a much harder narrative to sell. We have to draft your children to die so they can suppress this peasant uprising against our favored government here.
Yeah, exactly, right. So hence the ignore enough details and squint at just the right angle, and you can sell it as a war for freedom and democracy. And again, the reason to sort of go back and relitigate this now is the insane extent to which American discourse about this still treats it as if it was a war fought at least with that goal, however ineptly or tragically or unwinnably it may have been, right? Which is also, again, the template for how people talk about these these later wars, right? So
it's a colonial war. And Vietnam veterans, we have quotes from the book from Bill Earhart, who's a great writer who's a Vietnam veteran. He actually appears in the Ken Burns documentary, and he's a poet, and he's written for Current Affairs a few times. And what he says is that when he got there, he really thought he had internalized World War II movies growing up, right? So he's like a teenager, and he joins the Marines because he thought he was going to be Audie Murphy in World War II. He thought that he would be greeted by girls with flowers. And he said the first kind of mind fuck when he gets there is that the people of Vietnam clearly hate him. Like, they hate him. And he doesn't understand why they hate him. And then he starts seeing U.S. soldiers abusing the Vietnamese. And, they're instructed never to call them Vietnamese. They can only call them by racial slurs. And they, beating the crap out of them, casually killing them. He said he saw them, they had detainees who were for interrogation. And he said they were being tossed off they had their feet bound, and they were being tossed off a high truck, just tossed onto the ground, and they were breaking bones, like they're being moved around like sacks of potatoes. And he said he was like, but we're here to help these people. What is going on? And so he said it just did not make sense. He said it was totally and completely crazy and unintelligible because the narrative that he'd been given just didn't fit at all with what was actually happening in front of his eyes.
Right. Well, speaking of that, of course, the last American helicopter left Vietnam several years before I was born. But when I was in college, this happened, right? 9/11 and the wrecking of Afghanistan. And, this is this is something that, again, I think is, had, at least for a very long time, this very persistent, this sort of very persistent narrative that, it was, at least a fundamentally noble war, that, certainly at least a defensible one, that, that's like, oh, well, Iraq is something different, but, but Afghanistan, we had to do that. And, so I can remember, for example, if you go back and look at, Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primary in large part because, he could claim to have, been against the Iraq war because he gave a, long before, showing up in the Senate, he gave a speech in 2003 opposing the invasion of Iraq. And if you go back and actually reread that Obama speech, what he says is that Iraq is a stupid war. We are taking our eye off the ball of the war that we should actually be fighting, which is the war in Afghanistan, right? Like, so that was the sort of, that was like the reasonable liberal position that, like, okay, sure, maybe Iraq is too much, right? But obviously, of course, we should be fighting in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And once again, Chomsky gives you a few facts that start to complicate the narrative, right? So in Vietnam, when you find out that the government we're defending is not a democratic government, that we're defending it against its own people, this complicates the narrative. Now, in Afghanistan, there are a few things that complicate the narrative. One of those things is that we emphasize in the early stages of the book is that anti-Taliban Afghans were horrified by the U.S. bombing of Afghanistan and were pleading with the U.S. to stop bombing Afghanistan in October of 2001 because they were saying, essentially, like, you're creating recruits for the Taliban. You're blowing up villages here. We've been trying to build an anti-Taliban opposition here in Afghanistan, and you're going to wreck all of this work. Another important fact is that 9/11 happens, and you might ask, well, what could the United States have done differently? But there's a really obvious answer, which is that the United States could have accepted the Taliban's negotiation overtures that were being made to turn over Osama bin Laden. So the United States threatens to invade Afghanistan and demands that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban say, we'll hand over Osama bin Laden, but only to a third country and only upon you providing evidence of his guilt. And if you do that, we will hand over Osama bin Laden to a third country, not to the United States. This is a face-saving compromise, essentially. So they're not seen to be handing him over to the United States. And then he could face he could face justice, right? Yeah. He could face a court. He can face an international tribunal. The United States says, the Bush administration says, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? You're a bunch of terrorists. We're not negotiating with you. You hand Osama bin Laden over, or we invade your country. Then the Taliban gets a little, drops the demand that he be handed over to a third country, just requires evidence of his guilt. The United States goes in, deposes the Taliban, right? They say repeatedly, we're not engaging in negotiations with the Taliban over Osama bin Laden. Massive missed opportunity, because what does it lead to? A 20-year occupation of that country, supposedly conducted initially in order to bring the mastermind of 9/11 to justice. Could have happened, possibly. We don't know how those negotiations would have gone, but might have been able to happen entirely without the 20-year occupation that ended in the restoration of the Taliban. So, good war?
Yeah, well, not to mention that when Osama bin Laden was eventually killed by the United States, which I don't I don't love that either, because because in general I think there doesn't seem to have been any attempt whatsoever to capture him, so he could have been put on trial, etc. It was just kind of a hit. But putting that aside, when that happened, right? Well, that was like a few special forces guys in a country that was not invaded by the United States, right? Yeah. So if that was the whole point was to get Osama bin Laden, then like the second that happened, I mean, that should have been like, wait a second, right? If you could just do something like this, why do you have to carpet bomb, invade, and occupy an entire country and spend 20 years, bombing wedding parties?
People also don't realize that the government we were supporting in Afghanistan for most of that time was totally corrupt and unpopular, that it just totally lacked popular legitimacy, that we were supporting just horrific, brutal warlords who'd been anti-Taliban, but certainly had no interest in democracy, that this government was, it was like the South Vietnamese government. It was propped up entirely by the United States and dependent on the constant funneling of hundreds of millions of dollars. And without that support, as we saw when it was eventually pulled, the Taliban just immediately took over the country again. And that was what was going to happen because you hadn't created anything with any popular legitimacy in that country. So, I mean, no matter when you left, if if we left in 2005, if we left in 2015, or we left in 2021, they were going to come back.
Oh, well, surely if we'd just stuck it out for another 10 or 20 years, then everybody would have grown to love the government we were propping up, because that's definitely happened.
The other thing that Chomsky points out is that we might not have the Taliban in power today if we had not invaded the country. And that's that's kind of crazy, right? Because we invaded the country to topple the Taliban. But the point that he makes about the anti-Taliban forces is he says the Taliban at the time we were invaded were unpopular. Right? They were not popular. The people of Afghanistan were not pleased with the Taliban's rules, and there was organized opposition to the Taliban. He said, but our occupation turned the Taliban into the resistance force. Right?
Yeah, right. And again, I mean, the sort of, I mean, really the brutality of that is pretty incredible, right? I mean, that the United States spent 20 years in that country, I mean, doing things like house to house raids, rounding people up. I mean, we had Guantanamo Bay, was full of people who somebody who were there on hearsay, right? Because they were picked up after the invasion, and held in brightly lit cells on the other side of the world. Again, I mean, the fact that occupation, I mean, it had.
Oh. Ben, I lost your audio there. And it looks like Jake can't hear you either. So there we go.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah, about like the degree of like the degree of arrogance in that detail that throughout like years and years and years, it had never gotten to the point where the occupying army had learned to tell the difference between shots being fired into the air in a wedding celebration and Taliban attacks, right? I mean, that you had decades, right, of this stuff. I mean, the thing if you believed that the purpose of American, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. If you believe that the purpose of American involvement in Afghanistan was to free the women of Afghanistan, to spread democracy and civil liberties and gender equality and et cetera to Afghanistan, this doesn't seem like it would be the way to do it. I mean, this seems like exactly not how to win friends and influence people, right? But of course, I mean, this sort of characteristic of Chomsky point about this should be like, well, don't just assume that people's intentions are whatever they say and then like be befuddled at the disconnect between that and what they do, right? I mean, like actually look at what intention would make sense given what they do.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Chomsky is how uninterested he is in intentions. I think you've probably discussed on this program at some point his exchanges with Sam Harris, and we might have talked about that together because it's an exchange over the value of intentions, of good intentions, in which Harris is making the argument, well, there's a huge difference between the morality of the United States and Israel, who do things for noble purposes, even if they end up killing way more people in just as gruesome of ways. And there's a huge moral difference between that and a suicide bomber who intentionally kills civilians. And Chomsky's basically not particularly persuaded by that, because he's more interested in what he calls the predictable consequences of your actions. So if what you do is something you knew was going to happen and you chose to do it, then you might as well have intended the consequence. You know, you say, I intended the thing I knew would cause the consequence, but I didn't intend the consequence. I mean, Chomsky's not very persuaded by that. Like, I dropped the bomb on the house knowing that it would kill people inside the house, but I didn't mean to kill the people. I just meant to flatten the house. Chomsky doesn't see much of a moral difference between that and I dropped the bomb on the house in order to kill the people in the house. And certainly the same to the people in the house, right? I mean, there's no disputing that, like, from the victim's standpoint, these actions are indistinguishable. And in fact, the actions of the United States and Israel are far more bloody and brutal and worse than the much lower scale violence of our enemies. There's no disputing that the scale is different. The argument is that there's a big moral difference between collateral damage and intentional killing. And Chomsky's like, but you know that if you're dropping bombs indiscriminately, you're going to cause all this damage. How much different is that from terrorism? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's one thing to say that intentions can be exculpatory if you had, you know, if you just didn't, if it really was like a sort of tragic situation where you had no way of knowing that what you were doing was going to have that consequence, right? You know, that you're, you know, backing, you know, the car out of the driveway and it turned out that there was a child playing hide and seek in, you know, a pile of leaves or something, right? Like, but on the other hand, if you drive through a playground, and you know you're driving through a playground, and like it could be that your intention is not to kill any particular child, but you know your intention is, you know, even if you're
just trying to get to work.
Yeah, just a shortcut, right?
I just don't care if there are any children in my way. I'm not trying to kill children. I just don't care if that. I mean, in your example, right? So backing out, we see not intention but knowledge as making the difference, as the key point of moral difference, right? Because if you know the child's behind your car, right, and you drive back out, it doesn't matter. If you know the child is behind you, we would actually consider you a total sociopath and monster if you were like, oh, yeah, no, I knew they were behind me. I didn't intend to kill them. I was just backing my car out, and I wasn't going to change the course of my action just because there was a child back there. I'm not trying to kill anyone. I mean, we just wouldn't accept that as a moral distinction between that and deliberate first-degree premeditated murder. It's like, if you knew you were going to kill someone and you did this thing, you're culpable.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a moral distinction, you know, you're still the you know, like knowing it and not caring is certainly bad enough that, you know, it's not an exculpatory distinction. So yeah, I mean that this is so in the Chomsky kind of view about this, I mean, what was the American goal? You know, what was the actual American goal in the war in Afghanistan for those 20 years?
Well, sadly, just to assert dominance and power after being struck, right? So 9/11 had been a humiliation to the empire, and so the empire struck back. George W. Bush had a quote we have in the book where he said after 9/11, he said, "I'm struggling to contain my bloodlust," right? And so it wasn't. It wasn't to obtain real strategic advantage is one of the kind of interesting things. Because, I mean, if you remember, I think some of the left-wing anti-war discourse in 2001, 2002 suggested that the United States wanted to build an oil pipeline in Afghanistan, and that's why I think that was even in Fahrenheit 9/11.
Yeah.
But one of the things is we're trying to come up with explanations for why it could be strategic, because it certainly wasn't benevolent. But it also didn't seem particularly rational from a power building perspective. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries on earth. Maintaining a friendly government in Afghanistan doesn't get you many advantages as an empire. So I really do think it was, we talk about mafia logic and The Godfather in the opening chapter, and it's a very good way to kind of understand things, which is to say that The Godfather may do things for rational, strategic power building reasons, but The Godfather might also be just enforcing a rule that you don't mess with The Godfather. And when you do, if you go up and you kill his child, there's going to be revenge. There's going to be payback. There's going to be a price to pay for striking the powerful.
Yeah, right. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, this is, this is like, I can remember leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people very confidently saying that, whatever saber rattling's going on, Russia's not actually going to invade Ukraine because that would so clearly be an insane thing for them to do.
So it won't happen because human beings act rationally.
They'd have so much to lose, all of which was totally true.
Yeah.
But it turns out that empires aren't always rational actors, which I actually think that it's sort of. I think that given, in that case, obviously you'd also discuss that later in the book, but, in that case, I think that, given this sort of strong sense of being disrespected, having these various beefs with Ukraine and the West about, NATO expansion, about, the status of, Donetsk and Luhansk, all that stuff, I think not having gotten anything at the negotiating table, I think that again, this does feel very mafia-ish to me, right? I mean, it's like you could sort of imagine this as a Sopranos episode, right? One of the characters is, they feel disrespected at the sit down, right? So they start some crazy mob war that ends up being incredibly destructive to their business interests. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.